Good evening. Good evening and welcome everybody. A lot of excitement in the building, I think, because people are getting ready to go on these amazing studio trips. Welcome. I'm Gary Hilderbrand, a Hornbeck Professor of Practice of Landscape Architecture and Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture. And it's a great pleasure to have you here at this evening's event. A lecture by noted scholar and teacher and landscape architect Kofi Boone, entitled Recognition, Reconciliation, Reparation. I'll begin by acknowledging that the Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to them. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American program, who wrote this tribute and who have cultivated the relationships that led to a wider recognition of the fact that we are on dispossessed lands. Before we get to Kofi's talk, a reminder that we have live captioning for our virtual audience tonight. Just click the closed captioning button at the bottom of the live stream window. I want to give a big thanks to Matt and Kat, Paige and Brian, who always do great work to welcome guests and to host pretty flawless programs. I also want to invite you to join us for a great upcoming event on Thursday of next week, March 2nd at 6:30. We'll have a ceremony and a reception celebrating the 14th Veronica Rudge Green Prize in Urban Design, this amazing project you see in the Drucker Gallery. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock in Loeb Library, Assistant Professor Danielle Choi will talk about her remarkable book project, Outsiders, an environmental history of interior landscapes. So please join us for that if you are able. Also following tonight's lecture, the student curators of the Tange Pavilion, outside behind us, who work under the name Snobs, I'm not going to get into what that stands for, invite you to come outside the building for a video screening starting at 8 o'clock and looping until 9:30. The screening, in celebration of Black History Month, features a docu-series of 3 short films. It begins with Erased from the Narrative, a series of interviews capturing the realities of life as a Black woman. This video seeks to join the discourse around acknowledging and uplifting Black women's unique embodied experiences. This is followed by Hidden Histories, a video on hidden narratives of systemic racism in the United States and the world, depicted through posters designed by 12 students, where each was printed, placed, and documented at a selected site, distributed. And lastly, Body and Space, a series of interventions that question perceptions associated with the iconic image of a hooded figure in black. That should be really interesting to see. This evening, it's my great honor to welcome you to hear a talk by our esteemed guest, Kofi Boone. Thanks, Kofi, for taking time out of your semester to be here. And we managed to summon one of our warmest ever February days for you. It's probably just like the temperature you left. Kofi's lecture is supported by an endowment at GSD established in the honor of Sylvester Baxter. Baxter was a visionary advocate for landscape architecture and town planning, who, along with Charles Eliot and others, secured the passage of legislation that established the groundbreaking metropolitan park system of Greater Boston in the 1890s. Nobody had done that before. We all continue to enjoy the results of that beneficent action, and here at the design school we continue to interrogate the conservation ethic behind that work 130 years later. At yesterday's monthly meeting of the Faculty of Design here in the school, we heard a presentation by Vice Provost Sarah Bleich on the recommendations from Harvard's Presidential Committee on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery. We're learning more every day about the university's emerging plans for reparative efforts that descend from last year's committee report on the entanglements with enslaved labor and the role of the fortunes that were made in the slave trade that supported the university's growth during so long a period in the 17th and 18th centuries. Harvard's committed $100 million to this effort, which is massive. The inquiry started with a class in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences that examined ties to slavery around 2008. Kofi Boone has been working on related subjects, primarily the spatial, economic, and social impacts of prolonged structural racism in the US that followed the emancipation of slaves for just about as long as Harvard has. He was very early in this. We were discussing that timeline briefly earlier today. His window on the topic starts from personal experience growing up in Detroit during the nadir of that city's economic plight in the 1980s and especially the early 90s when we had one of our worst recessions ever. As a landscape architect since that time, his publications and institutional affiliations have been consequential for the field and well beyond the field. In 2014, Kofi and I both spoke at what I think of as one of the first conferences to be organized around spatialized issues of race and justice. That was in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he lives and teaches. My talk addressed the emergence of Black student culture and the gradual integration of Black students in the 1960s at Duke University, where my partner Eric Kramer and I were creating a new set of spaces for student life in the heart of the campus. That history was interesting for the project. Kofi's talk was more memorable. It was the first time I'd heard him speak about racialized topography. This was a stirring revelation of data and mapped imagery that outed the racist policies and practices that had led to the ghettoizing of Black communities in the degraded margins of cities across the eastern seaboard and the South, in the parts of towns where drainage was poor and flooding was prevalent, along the railway infrastructure, alongside industrial corridors, extraction sites. That's where these communities had grown. He spoke of topographic disadvantages that corresponded directly to districts that were denied access to mortgages, where schools were defunded, where essential city services were perpetually distressed. Landscape architecture was implicated. But for Kofi, Black landscapes mattered. His voice on this was one of the first, and it will come through tonight loud and clear. Kofi's the Joseph D. Moore Distinguished Professor and University Faculty Scholar at NC State University in the College of Design. He took his baccalaureate and master's degrees at the University of Michigan, his home state. There are many accolades and awards and an amazing, extensive publication record, much of which is geared towards contemporary media and dissemination platforms that give him really broad exposure. I think this is one of his unique contributions. He's also most recently published in the 2020 book, Black Landscapes Matter, edited by Grace Mitchell-Tada and Walter Hood. Kofi serves also on the boards of the Black Landscape Architects Network and the Land Loss Prevention Project. I want to highlight, finally, one of the places where Kofi's had a particular impact on the collective aspiration to diversify the discipline of landscape architecture. As a board member and immediate past president of the Landscape Architecture Foundation, he's helped to steer what I think of as a very consequential DEIB project. I had a little bit of a role in one part of this effort and saw Kofi's leadership at work. A working group under LAF guidance spent the better part of a year devising a scholarship, internship, and mentorship program for landscape architecture students of African descent or of BIPOC identity. This program is rolling out just now, and LAF just awarded in the last month or so the inaugural scholarships, 4 of them, $10,000 annually through their undergraduate or graduate careers to 4 Black students, 2 BLAs and 2 MLA students. The really compelling thing about this program is its focus on retention. It's not a one-time gift. Keeping these students in school is what's important. But also, it's a focus on longevity, so going beyond school, by providing paid internships and career mentoring into the future. It is really about one's career, squarely aimed at increasing the prospects for leadership potential for these students, these very select students. There's a corresponding program that's related to this, come out of the same working group at the American Society of Landscape Architects, that helps to build a pipeline for students in K through 12 curricula. All of this is rooted in the belief that if we close the barriers to access, close those barriers, through these measures, we begin to address the disproportionate oppression and disinvestment that people of color have experienced, and we'll diversify what looks like a very white profession today. We're all grateful to Kofi's and to LAF's leadership in opening doors and possibilities in these ways. Kofi was lucky to have an enlightened advisor in high school, and he's followed a path, he's going to mention this tonight, followed a path to substantial impact in the field, as I've said. We all gain from his presence, his teaching, his leadership, his design research, his publications, and his presence here tonight. It's great to have you here, Kofi.
Appreciate that. Oh. What up, dog? What's going on, man? You good? Yeah. I'm just going to ask Gary to say that again for my mother, who thinks I'm partying with my man here. Teron Dorsey, my friend of many years. So, and Mariama White Hammond here as well. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Recognition, reconciliation, reparation. A lot of re's, but want to cover some bases from some more recent work with a colleague, Julian Edgemon, who teaches at Tufts. So if he's online, I'll say hi. I'll see him later while I'm in Boston and Cambridge. But it's a topic that's come up for centuries, but in particular in our profession, how do we position ourselves as practitioners and educators and researchers and advocates to treat the places that we make and think about to enable these forces to occur. So this is by no means exhaustive, but it touches on some of these themes. As a start, actually I was told to introduce myself for the folks online, cisgender, middle-aged, black man from Detroit. And I like to show this picture of Detroit because people have a lot of different perceptions of my hometown. It's a place that actually I truly love and had great experiences with, and didn't know as a kid how landscape architecture, design, and planning played a role in enabling that. So Belle Isle Park, Detroit, by the way, has a reputation of running out all the great designers right after they get started. So started as Hog Island, an island in between Canada and the United States. Folks hired Frederick Olmsted to come through and do a master plan, and he got about a third of the way through, and they told him to get out of here. First and many, Daniel Burnham, like you just name everybody from the 19th and 20th century, and they all have like these half-done projects. But this 900-acre island park was an important refuge and oasis for all of us. I grew up on the east side of Detroit. There were very few parks and open spaces. We'd go across the bridge and just spend all day there, so it was great. In terms of culture and fine arts, probably Detroit's greatest contribution in the fine arts, the great Detroit Industry mural by Diego Rivera, who slid in his Marxist agenda unbeknownst to many in the paintings, representing the multiracial coalitions and the potential of tapping into the primordial spirits and the places from which resources were derived. His observations of the Rouge plant translated into great works of art of people of different backgrounds working together to build and to work together. So that's a great inspiration for us all. Cranbrook Academy, so in the mid-20th century, if you're into mid-century modernism, a lot of people were in Detroit and suburban Detroit because they were connected to the auto industry. So the Saarinen, the Yamasakis, Osamu Noguchi was in Detroit all the time, but these are Alil and Errol Saarinen, their masterwork, Cranbrook Academy Arts, just north of Detroit. So had a really interesting experience of space and design, not knowing that there were designers. But also another side. So this is a project you may have never heard of. This is the Hilderbrand project, which was created by Tyree Guyton, a resident of a Detroit neighborhood, walking distance from where I grew up on the east side, who heard the ghost of his father, who told him to paint polka dots in the street. This is a period of time in the 80s in Detroit when crack epidemic had just launched. Young Boys Incorporated, there's a movie about it if you want to see it. And this was his interesting commentary on loss, on grief, on feeling like a cast-off object. So all of his work are cast-offs, like he would dumpster dive and staple teddy bears to trees and painted numbers on houses. It was so obnoxious it drove out all of the crack dealers and all the folks. So I had this sort of activist kind of spirit to it. But it's a whole nother side of the city that I grew up in. And as I went to Michigan and started to learn more about urbanism and landscape architecture and architecture, understood some of the dynamics that led to Detroit's condition. That's Boston, and San Francisco and Manhattan, all within the boundary of the city of Detroit. So something Chris knows well because he was involved in a little bit of this. The scale of it. I remember being in college and people thinking I was rich because I lived in a single family detached house. Was not rich. But Fordism, right? The legacy of Henry Ford in terms of paying workers enough to be able to purchase the Model T, first of all. But for people, particularly from the urban migration coming up from Alabama and Mississippi, as strike bakers, as scabs, essentially, to disrupt labor unions that were forming at the time, coming in with low-skill, high-wage labor such that we could all afford homes. And until as late as the 1980s, Detroit did have the highest rate of home ownership in the nation, which shocks a lot of people. But there are consequences from globalization. So as we start to deal with the grips of that now, we were, in a sense, ahead of the curve in terms of putting all our eggs in one basket. For people who want to know more about Detroit, there's an excellent book by Thomas Sugru, The Origins of the Urban Crisis. He's a historian out of Penn, who talks about after World War II, Detroit was the most technologically advanced city in the country because it got retooled as the arsenal of democracy. So the first to have, improvements in communication lines, efficient transportation and manufacturing technology, and were offered Silicon Valley by the federal government, to which Walter Reuther and everybody were like, no, we're good building cars, we're okay. And so when people track the decline of the city, they usually attribute it to the riots in the 60s, but at that point it had already started to percolate and move because of major federal policy. So it was like an aha moment for me as a student to understand that a lot of the situations that I found myself in our communities in, and the causational relationships that were being formed, it was behavioral, right? Like if you pulled your pants up and you spoke proper English and you went to church and did all these things, that somehow your moral and ethical fiber would carry you through against these huge systemic forces. And it was a major aha moment for me to say that, no, sometimes that's policy, sometimes that's decision making, sometimes there's people taking advantage of and benefiting from the deprivation of other people. And it's not always the mustache twisting villain like in a movie. Sometimes it's a collective consciousness and priorities. So a perfect example is a legacy of redlining. In the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation went around the United States mapping cities to see the suitability for extending home loans and coded them by streets. There are about 160 of these maps available at the University of Richmond's Mapping and Equity Project. There were 3 codes, essentially. Green was like having a credit score of 770. You're good, right? Buy a car, take our money, you're good. Yellow, you're kind of on the fringe. Red, absolutely not, right? We're not loaning to you. The #1 predictor of how you got in the red line was the percent black of that community in that neighborhood. And they were very barefaced with it. Their maps from where I am in Durham, North Carolina, where they literally track door by door, black house, black house, black house, red, right? So it doesn't seem like a lot. Let's deal with something that's sort of benign. Where I live, they call Raleigh the city of Oaks, which makes me laugh because I've been to Savannah. Raleigh is not the city of Oaks. But let's take that for example. Most of the trees that form the city's identity were planted in the 30s as a part of the New Deal. So, you know, a generation and 100 years later, you see these canopied neighborhoods that enjoy all the benefits of these natural systems, the shade, the habitat, the benefits to private property values, all that stuff, right? Versus other communities, redline communities, which did not. So you can correlate even that, street tree patterns and infrastructure improvements from the 30s, the divide over generations. So you think about that, if you go 100 years without investment in your community, and this is federal policy, this isn't individuals deciding they just didn't like black people. I have gray hair, this is before my time, this is Hastings Street in Detroit in the 1950s when it was bustling, this was black bottom. Black because of the soil, not the people. But was the place where many people who came up in the Great Migration came, developed businesses, and did work. As we know now, 60 cities that have been documented and more growing, they were the targets of urban renewal. So another shock a generation later of saying that the underinvestment, sustained underinvestment that came from redlining American cities, a generation later came with this massive upheaval as cities were trying to disperse, right, protect themselves from the Red Scare. That was like the big engine, right? That's why the federal highway system was invented. That's why these massive homeowners loans were provided for the suburbs. Yes, they fueled white flight, but they were scared of nuclear annihilation due to our concentrated population from the Soviet Union. So black people in place destroyed and redeveloped ostensibly to compete with greenfield sites for development practices. But there was this coincidence that they always destroy black communities to do that. My colleague, Mindy Full of Love, describes this phenomenon as serial displacement and talks about these epochs along the way. If we get into the question and answer, I can explain a little bit more about racialized topography, which was referenced, but the idea is that almost every generation there's a major shock to our communities, in many cases fueled by policy decisions, resulting in root shock, a great book that she wrote, if you're not familiar with it, which talks about the psychological impacts of losing your home place. It profiles the South Bronx with the work of Robert Moses and the impact of displacing that community, as well as the Hill District in Pittsburgh, and it tracks it in terms of mental health, the spread of disease. It's just a horrifying kind of thing. And to that extent, that white circle is where I grew up, 6 years of shorter life expectancy due to environmental factors, not lifestyle or genetic or health factors. So Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has that life expectancy by zip code. You should probably look up where you're from and see how it compares to national and state average. And also has, and this is just one measure of wealth, and that's one topic that I want to get into in the talk, is that monetary wealth is only one thing. There's lots of capitals, lots of wealth that landscape architects can create places to enable their growth. But in terms of monetary wealth, black communities, black homes, black places just don't have the same value as others, which results in the inability to pass down generational wealth. It's not all depressing. There are people who resist it and used organization as a way to overcome lack of resources. This is one of the great superheroes of Detroit who passed away, Grace Lee Boggs, and her husband, James Boggs. You cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. So among her many interventions was the idea of the Freedom Summer model from the South applied to the city of Detroit. So the same like door-to-door, street-to-street, community organization and mobilizing, applying that to changes in the built environment. It was really transformational for a lot of us. There are a lot of perceptions. I have 2 teenagers. I think they're lazy. Our generation in particular, full disclosure, doesn't think very much of the younger generations. Until the pandemic. Largest global protests in world history. Mostly people who didn't have any connection to George Floyd. And mostly people who had never been in that position before to respond in that way. So for that, a mea culpa, my bad from our generation to yours. We should have known better. But we refer to it as the twin pandemics. This is a great article that was in Landscape Architecture magazine where we were dealing with COVID revealing these savage inequalities that were in some cases disguised and masked by protests, the lack of access to adequate health care, to living conditions, to mobility and to open space, all the things that help people remain healthy, divided on class and race lines. But also racial equity, right? Brought that front and center. That for the first time, that was the first time people saw somebody lynched in real time. And the world erupted. And I'm glad it did. George Floyd became and remains a symbol of a lot, and he was going to come up a few times in this lecture. It's interesting that it is tied to the topic because his family was from Rayford, North Carolina. They owned 500 acres there in the late 19th century. They would have been considered wealthy today, but they were run out by racial violence. That's why they weren't there today. And where he went in Houston has a really interesting story as well, but we'll pick up on that. A number of us were looking at comparisons in terms of different moments. Almost 100 years ago was the influenza pandemic, which at that time was may have been the biggest killer after tuberculosis in that era. So that was an era of a health crisis. The Great Depression was just getting started, so we were in an economic crisis. Climate crisis, the Dust Bowl, right? So the breadbasket in the United States was starting to erode and fall apart. So 100 years later, we're in that same boat. How did our country and how did we all respond? Well, that's where the New Deal came from. That's where all these major elements to deal with all of these challenges kind of came from. And so on this road to this idea of recognition, reconciliation and reparations, we attempted to, in addition to what Gary mentioned, Landscape Architecture Foundation, the Grounding the Green New Deal Summit, and the Super Studio, which had 3,000 participants in 17 different countries, trying to create projects to visualize decarbonization, justice, and green job creation wherever they were. Really strong groups from Harvard, so for that, we appreciate it. But the beginnings of that idea of saying that, well, maybe we can't go back to business as usual after we had these massive shocks to the system. Maybe we can't reclaim what's happened because of political divides and polarization, but the scale, right? The scale of what we're facing requires large-scale mass action. And the cover of the lecture comes from a current project, so we're not at the point where we have work to show for it, but it kind of sets the stage for some of the things we'll talk about a little bit later. This is Catawba Trail Farm, which is north of Durham. It's a wonderful site. Right now what you're looking at is a 17-acre plot, which is sort of the agricultural plot, but it extends much further beyond these boundaries to a conservation easement along the Little River. What's interesting about it is that it sits right in the middle of what was the largest plantation in North Carolina, owned by the Cameron family. 30,000 acres, bigger than the footprint of the city of Durham today, with 1,000 enslaved people. The people that were working that, the black person is a descendant of the families that once worked there. It's a place that has an incredible amount of trauma, but they're trying to transform it in a way that connects people to the land in healthful ways. And it explains an interesting phenomenon, at least we're exploring here. I don't know how it is here, excuse me, I don't know how it is here. But there's a lot of conservation land today that used to be plantation land in North Carolina, along river corridors, along fertile areas. And so we're exploring this sort of coincidence or this overlay or this overlap of these two. And so if we have communities that see stronger connections to the land, including ownership as a path to liberation, and we have abundant conservation lands that have historically excluded those particular communities, how can we forge some connections? So we're early in this process, but part of this talk is trying to frame some of these conversations. This is the board of Urban Community Agronomics with the very cool acronym UCAN, developing their own visions of what they'd like to see on the site. So we're very early in the process, just trying to get a sense of where they are and what they think. To get into the talk itself, this is an article that Julian and I co-wrote a couple years ago, examining the idea of the Black Commons. The Black Commons was proposed by the Schumacher Center. Schumacher Center, among other things, which we'll talk about, codified community land trusts in 1967. They were the ones that wrote the initial policies that a lot of us have used in the past. Their concept of the Black Commons was to meet the scale of community ownership and land ownership for Black communities fast enough to allow the stabilization of those communities and to build wealth. There needs to be a new model to organize discontinuous parcels of land into a big commons. So to try and encourage people to donate into this discontinuous web of land with the sole purpose of trying to stabilize and build wealth with Black communities. We started to look at it in the context of how people were responding post-George Floyd, the political action, the other places, but the underlying causes, the economic causes that were tied to the land, that not being strong enough. And the idea of circular economies, which we're familiar with inanimate objects and parts of our world that aren't human, we understand these idea of these closed loops of there is no waste, right? Waste equals food, feeds the cycle and continues that perpetual process. And what if we thought about applying that to people? And so reading about how the Human Development Index was created, the contributions of sin and many others, you know, can you create these mini cycles of investment that invest in capabilities in the pursuit of freedoms? In the pursuit of freedom, in a decentralized kind of way. In Julian's world, he's British, so he said Commonwealth. I kind of went, oh, okay. But the idea of redefining and reclaiming that term, right? The idea that it's really social goods held in common. So this became this sort of model that we wanted to sort of add to, and it got picked up by Jane and Julian and a number of others in Sacred Civics, Building 7 Generation Cities. Cool book, free, open access. Don't you have to pay for it? I appreciate you paying for it, but you can get it for free. So this talk is framed around that chapter. There's some language. There's lots of ways of interpreting these terms. I'm not saying it's the only way. But for the purposes of the talk, we're going to use some definitions and kind of push through. So with recognition, recognizing and respecting human beings, their status and their rights. In a lot of ways, it's been a revelation and has been welcome that we actually acknowledge indigenous and African people in landscape architecture now. Not everybody does, but leading programs and firms do. Excluded when I was in school, right? From history class, theory class, no case studies, no projects, no precedents, no instructors, nothing. And if you're in the United States and you don't acknowledge the land that was stolen and the people that were stolen to work the land, and ironically, the least represented groups of people in our profession are the people, those same groups of people, then we got a disconnect. So this is a really naive map. I'm not saying this is authoritative, but it gets a mental picture of the complexity of the nations, the tribes, and the other groups of people that once were here. That white circle is where we are in North Carolina. And then it gets into dispossession and land loss. A shocking trend for people who aren't familiar with it in terms of the amount of land that has been dispossessed from groups of people. It's interesting spending a lot of time with indigenous people. A lot of them don't like land acknowledgments. And it's interesting because a lot of them really don't want the land back because they didn't own the land in the first place. So it's sort of a clash of worldviews and perspectives. When you see the land as your brother or your sister or a family member, you convey personhood to a river, a mountain, or a tree. You don't treat it like property. And so one of the weaknesses of my talk, I'm going to put it out there, criticisms is that we're dealing within the world of private property, the concept of ownership of land, which a lot of people don't agree with. It's just inherently flawed. But acknowledging these trends and these traditions, Pierre Bellinger's work, No Design on Stolen Land, which pushes us to consider if the land we're working on had treaties or agreements with indigenous people in the first place. Do we even include that in terms of our practice of seeking out what those pre-existing agreements were? And if they weren't, are you going to go out and talk to and work with those indigenous groups before you make a single move? In the past, we used to make fun of Harvard and private universities at land-grant institutions. We're like, oh yeah, we're the land-grant. Yeah, we serve the community. That's a part of our mission, right? But then there's this horrible article that came out called land-grab universities. And that's the map on the right. A lot of what funded the Umstead Act and the Morrill Act and land-grant institutions was the sale of stolen land out west from indigenous people. So now we're in it too. So we're trying to work that through our levels of complicity. But I think that idea of this generation, that being normal now, right? That something should go up when you're not really talking about who was there before we started to do all this stuff, is a part of this recognition moment. This is the oldest map we have showing enslaved African populations in the United States. In 1860, it was created in the Confederate States by county. It's also a soil map. So I mentioned Black Bottom before in Detroit. That's because of the soil. It used to be riverbed, very rich. But the darker colors with the higher percentages of enslaved African people were also the very rich soils in the southeast. So you can see the Mississippi River Delta very strongly, the southern parts of Virginia and other places. The idea that some of these are very resilient patterns. That's the racial dot map from 2010, showing the exact same thing, showing what we now know politically and demographically as the Black Belt, basically the same area where these concentrations of enslaved African people were. This is Raj Chetty's research on upward mobility and economic mobility. His work talks about the chance that you have to get from the lowest levels of poverty and out. The red areas are the areas in the United States that have the lowest chance of getting out of poverty. With Atlanta and Charlotte being the leaders, right, which seems crazy, right, because they're growing like crazy, they're booming. So we definitely have the capacity for these two things to exist at the same time, which is with global capital and advantaged people and communities outpacing everybody else. But it's interesting how resilient a lot of these patterns happen to be. This is the land loss map for the same area. So after Reconstruction, with the Homestead Act and a lot of other issues, land was available for African Americans to own in large quantities. But through policies with USDA, racial terror, the urban migration, a lot of factors, over 2 billion acres were lost in less than 100 years, with most of it lost since 1950. So it's not just an ancient history kind of thing, which is to say that African Americans, at least in the rural South, only own 2% of the land they once held 100 years ago for various reasons, all in the same kind of category. So these are the things that we talk about now, like just as a part of defining who we are and our position. To come back to George Floyd, one story about George Floyd, Houston. The school he went to was named after Jack Yates. Who is Jack Yates? Jack Yates was a prominent minister, founded the Colored People's Festival and Emancipation Park Association in 1872. That's a picture of the folks that donated to this thing, essentially a cooperative. People put their money in. What did they donate their money into? Well, after Juneteenth, they said we need a place to celebrate Juneteenth. So they bought 12 acres in Houston and created Houston's first park. Before private parks, private gardens, before the Houston park system, Black folks in Houston had a park. The whole purpose of it was to celebrate emancipation and celebrate Juneteenth. So sadly, the whole area has gentrified since then, but historically it's significant because when we start to talk about access and people seeing cultural relevance to the things that we do, we have a precedent from the 19th century that predates a lot of the things that happen in the rest of the city. It's the cultural competence of it. Jessica Nemhar has an excellent book on cooperatives in general. And you can see W.B. Du Bois' picture on the cover of that book. He was a huge proponent of cooperatives as a way of enabling people with low resources, particularly black people, to build resources together through cooperation. A lot of people may not have heard of the Black Wall Street story until they saw The Watchmen. So if you've seen it on HBO, that's the opening scene of that show, is people bombing a black neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I remember getting all these calls like, oh, that's science fiction, nobody did that. And it was like, hate to break it to you, that was true. What's interesting about it is that it wasn't called Black Wall Street until it was rebuilt. It was the Greenwood District, and immediately after it was destroyed, black business owners reached out to their national network through their cooperative and rebuilt in the exact same place. Black Wall Street wasn't lost until the 1990s due to urban renewal and freeway construction. But it was a resilient model, and it went everywhere. There's a Black Wall Street in Durham, where I live, where Mechanics and Farmers Bank and NC Mutual Life Insurance, up until the 1960s, the largest employers of black people in the country. Malik Akini, his great work with D-Town Farm, growing up into a cooperative grocery. They'll be the first one in Detroit, which is under construction now. So some of these things are connected to the past, and some things move forward. With community land trusts, there's a lot of definitions to it. They date back to England and to Great Britain, but in the United States, particularly in the post-civil, modern civil rights era, they were seen as an extension of the civil rights era. Towards the end, it was an economic empowerment argument as well as political. So the great Fannie Lou Hamer, founder of the Mississippi Freedom Party, conceived of this idea of Mississippi Freedom Farms. She's like, I want 9,000 acres in Mississippi. Why do you want it? Well, we're gonna take it out of real estate market. We're gonna create a board. We're gonna make our own rules. Sole purpose of it is to help these sharecroppers not have to keep paying rent and be able to save money and build wealth. We're gonna build this pig bank. So you got a pig, the pig has babies. We give babies to these other farmers. Those pigs grow up and have babies. They give the babies back so we can give those babies to the next round of farmers. If you've heard this before, this is the model for Heifer International with cows. They actually credit Fannie Lou Hamer for making this up. She doesn't get her 9,000 acres, but she gets 270 of them, and it becomes a real thing. The Schumacher Center, which was based in southwest Georgia, in rural Georgia, kind of gets wind of what Fannie Lou Hamer is doing, and they start talking about, well, we got to figure out this strategy as community stabilization model, a way to create permanent affordability for those most vulnerable. And in 1967, they write the code, right? And so there's hundreds of community land trusts all over the country, including one right down the street. So Dudley Street, the great Mel King in that great book. I remember meeting him in Detroit when I was a college student. Closing out the recognition section, this was just a shallow dive into elements that we need to be aware of to understand the situations within which we face and confront people in situations. The Cowrie Initiative, which was a component of Black Bank USA, asked us to start mapping these, and so the students started to map about 50 just in a very short scan of land trusts and cooperatives that were in black communities or black serving. Because if you don't know where they are, how they work, you can't relate to them. So we're glad to keep working on that. We're going to move on to reconciliation. Acknowledging responsibility for harm and accelerating healing. From a landscape standpoint, there are many people, particularly in the 20th century, who contributed to this idea. Carl Lynn, who brought his experience growing up in Israel and being in the kibbutz, sort of the open, free-form, experimental, cooperative areas that he had a lived experience with, to Philadelphia, to vacant lots. He didn't invent community gardens, but he definitely popularized them and codified them through Philadelphia Green, through the concept of community barn raising. From a more contemporary standpoint, work with Deb Gunther at Methuen as a part of LAF Research Fellowship, starting to map out the ecology of governance structures and trying to maximize collective impact. Her observation working with community groups, they're scattered and fragmented. How do we start to, through our work, cultivate relationships between them that help us all move forward. In terms of what we've done in North Carolina, the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum was a project in Sedalia, North Carolina that may speak to this. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, Boston native, who came to the rural South to establish what became the largest private college preparatory school for black students in the South, essentially on her own. And this site, if designated, would become the first state historic site in North Carolina dedicated to a black woman. There's Dr. Brown with some of the kids out in the lawn, playing in the cottage. Dr. Brown was a really interesting individual. Some of her philosophies extend from Du Bois, some from Booker T. Washington, brought them both together in terms of the need to advocate at different levels, but also sort of a self-sufficiency ethic at the same time. Raised her money by giving these incredible speeches, often with Eleanor Roosevelt, who was then vice president, for fundraising. Kept a journal, like this is a journal of her walk from the train station to her first contact in Sedalia, where she even kept track of native plants and the birds that were singing, and she was just sort of one of these forces of nature. Acquired this property in Sedalia, burned down, raised enough money to transfer all the buildings into masonry construction in the Georgian style, which I don't like, just full disclosure, but that was institutional academic architecture at the time. Used the site in tremendous ways. The graduates of this particular institution went everywhere. Nat King Cole married one of her nieces and used to come all the time. One thing that this helped was starting to map out these ecosystems of relationships that we usually don't pay attention to when we're working in landscape architecture. And we'll map out one that the students found really compelling. So Lois Mailou Jones, her first job was the art director for Paul Memorial Institute, Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum. So the great Harlem Renaissance painter who's credited for transformational work in Harlem actually started in the rural South of North Carolina working for Dr. Brown. One of her students, Betty Blayton, who also was a great artist in her own right, had a weirdo student named Jean-Michel Basquiat. So you start talking to these country people in rural North Carolina about Basquiat, you know, you got to tie to Basquiat. It changed everybody's perspective. At its heyday, it had the largest private art collection of black artists of any school in the South, including universities. These are all stories and histories that unless we value them, we can't use them. One of our students talked about the potential for this underutilized setting to be activated using some of these stories and conceived of the idea of an artist retreat that would celebrate and symbol some of the important aspects of Dr. Brown's life, the history of the place, but also be a setting for contemporary art and gathering. And so we're at the point now where these materials and a number of others the students prepared are being used to negotiate with the National Trust for Historic Preservation to support the renovation of that campus. So this reconciliation is sort of like a gap filler intermediate. We have an amazing capacity in our profession and through our institutions to take the burdens off of folks who are trying to make transformational change connected to the land. This definition of reparation is different than the ones we're dealing with now. Full disclosure, Schumacher Center today had a session on reparations called Leading Reparations Locally, which you can find online, that talks about some of the great work happening in Chicago and various other places on the ground. But this one is derived from SIN's definition, which is how do we catalyze investments in a sustainable way to help people have a fulfilling life. To bring it full circle, this is right outside of Minneapolis, one of the great black communities that actually use community cooperatives to build their wealth. It's the cover image of Collective Courage. Destroyed by I-94, the freeway, the community started to map businesses and things that were lost. They set up a small museum on the edge to help people gather and build in those places. They had a broader vision for how to heal that wound, remove the freeway, and put the businesses right back on top of where that scar was. Sadly, that idea was killed by their governor. They even had federal funding set up for that as a part of the infrastructure bill. But it illustrates that reparative work. In other cases, it's more iterative. The Power Corps in Philadelphia, part of the Conservation Corps network, working with folks to build their capacity of green businesses. I think that Boston is doing this now.
Yeah, our second cohort started last month.
There you go. Yeah. So the great Khalif Jones, who manages that program, cohort after cohort of people who had no connection to the environment, no connection to the land, certifications, access, job prospects, and actually learning to develop it and deal with it. An example of those capabilities. In Henderson, North Carolina, just north of where we are in Raleigh, one of the most successful cooperatives for Black farmers in the state, GROW, Green Rural Redevelopment Organization, with the Cruz family there, Henry and Artis, that do micro-market farming. So they work with Black farmers to either dedicate a small portion of their fields or to grow small batches, and they pool them all together. They look like, very nice, wholesome seniors, but they grow a lot of hemp and a lot of weed. That's their secret weapon. When I learned the profitability of hemp versus tomatoes, I kind of, what are you growing all these tomatoes for? Or you could do both, like Black Jesus, I guess you could do both. But our students in the greenhouse where they train that, them learning how we think about those things, so that cultural exchange. Our students, they got to deal with a company that, so here's what they did. So they saw that local hospitals, people who got treated for cardiovascular disease due to poor diet, when they're released and if they're on SNAP, then the federal government's required to give them a box of quote-unquote healthy food so they can make this transition to a healthier lifestyle. But it's usually, like you've heard about government cheese, it's cans of beans, it's all this horrible stuff that's got thousands of food miles on it. So Artis and Henry get in there and they're like, oh yeah, we got like 60 farmers around here that grow all this stuff. We could actually grow local, organic alternatives for that. Let us get in there and do that. Wildly successful, 3,000 of these meals a year in the beginning. And then they get approached by a company that makes these frozen, prepackaged healthy meals. And they're like, well, we want to do it, but we want to do it in a way that folks will eat it, right? So we need actually healthy, this is an oxymoron, healthy Southern food. So the students were figuring this out, like what's the price point that we would have to hit in order to scale up their capacity in order to meet this demand. So they're doing all this stuff that they never had to do before for the purpose of building power, wealth, and stability and control of a Black-led cooperative. They start looking at the town of Henderson and what's available in terms of just even open land and how much food that could produce. They start to look at disused structures and underutilized structures, and some of them had like industrial scale kitchens and large facilities that would allow people to move out of their houses and then to scale up in these functions so they could deliver more work and more food. They are successful, right? All of that work. They were given a school that was underutilized. It was renamed after a recent community leader who passed away, Andrea Harris, Rural Food Hub. Now instead of 3,000 a year, it's 3,000 meals a month. And now they're training other groups of people to be able to do the exact same thing. That idea. We'll close out with this one. This is Freedom Hill or Princeville, North Carolina. I was joking with Pamela in the beginning, like, yeah, it's pretty benign. I'm from Michigan. I'm used to 4 seasons. Now in North Carolina, where we got 2. Sadly, one of those is hurricanes. So we got hit with 3 1,000-year flood events in a 3-year period, mostly in eastern North Carolina, and all of them hit Princeville. Princeville is on the Tar River. There's an example of racialized topography. Some critical geographers did a study of over 100 cities across the southeast, looking at correlations between altitude and race. And unless you're on the coast, and with a few exceptions, you could predict the demographic profile of communities simply based on altitude, right? So you can imagine who's on high ground and who's not. What are some of the reasons? Well, a lot of these places in the South were established during the era of slavery and colonialism, so they were owned by white people. Black people either on the plantation or they made their living being adjacent to, as close as possible to their place of business, typically white people, in low-lying areas, right? This correlation and this pattern is called racialized topography. Princeville is a perfect case of that. High ground on one side of the Tar River is Tarboro, the county seat. Low ground, ironically, Freedom Hill. Where did Freedom Hill come from? When Sherman's army came in from the ocean during the Civil War, whenever they destroyed plantations or Confederate encampments, the formerly enslaved Africans that were in that area started following around the Union Army and camping next to them for protection. These were called contraband camps. This is a real thing. So the Union Army camped out in Tarboro for a long time. So they settled in a high point in the swamp. Freedom Hill, hill aspirational, right? Hill as in like spiritual, biblical, religious connotations, not elevation, which means that they built a town in an area that's flooded, had catastrophic floods 7 times since its founding. Founded in 1865 as Freedom Hill, today known as Princeville, after local carpenter Turner Prince. All of the black and white pictures are gone due to flood damage. So there's very little fabric from that day. The color pictures are including our workshop in 2017 where we got to know everybody and start to develop a long-term strategy to help them recover and be resilient and to thrive. That's what those color pictures mean. We started with something somewhat simple, which was usually in a flood and in resilience and disaster recovery, this was our first experience with FEMA and Army Corps of Engineers and all these agencies. They kind of inundate, okay, I'll pick a different word. They overload communities with too much information while they're in trauma and they're in crisis. Do you want to build? Do you want to leave? Do you want to sell your land? Do you want to stay? These are people who they don't know where their loved ones are. They don't have any, lost all their materials. They're just in a bad state. So we were kind of observing this and we kind of went, well, what if we could catalyze this ongoing community conversation that goes on throughout the process so that when the crisis comes, people are better prepared. But in the crisis, you deal with the crisis, right? You don't deal with these long-term decisions on the spot. So that's where the Home Place Guide came from. So we worked with 6 different communities, simple to read, simple to understand, graphics that show a lot of different things to enable that, available in booklet form and online. Did a workshop with the folks in Princeville for 5 days working in that site. I will take a moment to highlight this young lady here, Marquetta Dickens. We were working on all these strategies and trying to look professorial and professional and like, we're going to do this, that, and the third. And she's like, oh, we already got a plan. Just do that. So we said, this is exactly what you want, right? You don't want us coming in, dropping in, and doing stuff. We work with them in the short term to develop a walking tour. Most people have never heard the story of Princeville. All these high school kids in this picture are from an hour away, never heard Princeville. Where they're looking now is the Tar River. That's where the water came that direction. That's also the most southern navigable point from Virginia when boats carrying enslaved Africans had to stop in the water at that spot, transfer to smaller boats, go to land, and then walk to the slave block to be sold. So that was the beginning of that tour, being led by the folks from this organization. We brought them in to the college to talk about, well, you know, how do we think about this as designers? We exposed them to a lot of tools. Number one was them learning SketchUp, although it was all like 747 jets and Ferraris and anything in the clip art. Every once in a while, there was a really cool piece of landscape architecture. But it was important because it got them to imagine and dream big and to work. The thing that got them the most excited and then the most depressed was the flood damage done to the Welcome Center and the museum, because the condition of the town, the interpretation was not strong enough. So they went in expecting to hear that story, and then they were like, well, disappointed because they couldn't do it. One kid comes out and says, well, I wish this thing was on wheels. I was like, well, why should it be on wheels? Well, we could drive it away when the flood comes, then we can put it back. So I was like, So I went back to the college and talked to the head of the School of Architecture, David Hill. It's like, you know what? I was just talking with these kids. They want to do a museum on wheels. And he goes, you know, we got a design build studio, and our client just fell through, but we got the funding. I think we can do a museum on wheels. And we started talking about the other implications of it. It could become an advocacy tool. You could take it to the Capitol. You could take it to the National Museum of African American History. You could take it to HBCUs. You could take it anywhere and just pop up and tell the story. It could serve a lot of different roles in addition to protection of it. So 8 weeks later, the architecture students design built a mobile museum. The first exhibit in there that's moving around is photographs of the people who survived Hurricane Matthew. And it is completely under the control of the town of Princeville. The whole thing is like a poster. The initial charter is etched in Corten steel on the inside. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. While that's going on, I've mentioned Marquetta before. They formed the first nonprofit in Princeville. So now they can compete for other kinds of resources, Freedom.org. And their first projects are cemetery cleanup because an ancestor of Angela Davis is buried in the cemetery at Princeville. They want to get that thing on the National Register. Then they want to work with farm groups. Then they want to do these other things. There's a lot of overlap. They organized a black farm tour, and I had to yell at them because that picture is from Soulfire Farm. I was like, that's not y'all, that's Soulfire. I know that handsome guy on that side. But, you know, it was an idea of a homecoming, right? An idea of bringing people together and activating the networks that weren't there. They teamed up with Bikeworks NC and did a century ride. They attracted 400 people, black riders from across the country, to ride and experience farm landscapes in Princeville for the first time. They organized all these activities at all these farms. These were prompted by the owners of these particular properties. The farm to table supper by, here's Kendrick there. Kayak tours, a lot of activities that if we came in as designers like, hey, we should go kayak, and they look at us crazy. But because it's connected to the preservation of their land and their identity, and that they were in charge. And so the rest of us were technical consultants. Well, how do you charge a fee? What do you do with cars? How do you sell tickets? How do you maintain it? And we were just kind of servant leadership, just like, okay, you can do this, you can do this. The role was completely reversed. Wildly successful. 400 people came last year. They're expecting 1,000 this year. At the same time, and this is the end, my colleague Andy Fox, who directs the Coastal Design Dynamics Lab at State, is doing incredible work in a lot of different ways, discovers a flaw in the FEMA firm map system, that there's variation in the landscape that's only visible using LIDAR. And when they designate these flood zones, they didn't have access to that technology. So you actually could have parcels on a parcel by parcel basis that are out of the flood zone within a flood zone. So this new technology has allowed for a finer grained, detailed analysis of floodplains, such that you don't have to wholesale tell people anymore that they have to move. There are places that with minimal elevation, they could stay. And there are now defensible evidence-based reasons for reprogramming parcels that don't fit that category. They don't have to just sit fallow and be mown. They can generate food, they can be habitat, they can offer all these other pieces. So it was a major thing that happened. It took a year to do this. He calls it the floodprint process. And now it's on the road. It's now moving to other communities to start to discover if there are variations that our coarse grain analysis misses, but our fine grain analysis can pick up that can provide advantages for communities. That level of evidence-based information and data provided confidence to the Conservation Trust in North Carolina to underwrite this thing and develop the Princeville Collaborative, which is holding together a large group of partners to do long-term work, not just project by project, but with Princeville in particular. So some of their short-term stuff, reopening their elementary school, but also building and installing rain gardens. In the same manner that Power Corps works, developing a Princeville version of a Corps so that local Princeville kids are engaged in laying out and designing trails, building interpretive signage, leading some of the tours that we experienced in the first place, and becoming connected to that environment and regenerating what is one of the oldest free charter towns for Black people in the United States. With that, I'll end. These are some of the folks that were very influential in this particular work. You may recognize some of the faces. Julian is in the upper left, so some of this is a part of his mind meld as well. So with that, I'll say thanks and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Well, Kofi, this could at least have been a half-a-day symposium. There's so much in this talk. So we have a few minutes for questions. I'm going to start with one, and then we'll go to the audience. I've been for a while taken with the idea of a Black Commons and the idea that you could somehow have a distributed model or a dispersed parcels of land that create a common. And you know, we've posed that kind of question here from time to time. Along with that is the importance of collectives. This travels all the way through your talk, and it's an importance historically as a response to crisis or to chronic risk. And what is compelling about what you talk about today is that collectives are sort of exponentially valuable. Mm-hmm. And you continue to distribute the good that comes from collective action. So in your talk, it kind of looks like we have a pretty good picture here, but we don't.
Right.
There's a lot more work to do.
There's a lot. A
lot more work to do. I want to go to what we were chatting about earlier today. The span of this talk, which captures a lot of the good that's going on, but recognizes that a lot more has to happen, has been a relatively short period of awareness of this. And as you said, you were emphatic about what was missing in your education. Mm-hmm. But it's very present now. Would you talk about the timeline, say your accommodation of the racialized topography business, which I think was around 2014, if I'm not mistaken. 2016, Michael Brown's murder by police in Ferguson triggered a massive reaction in the country. There was an incredible demonstration of that trauma here in the GSD by the students. It was riveting and important. And around that time, you begin to get together. You form your own collective with other Black designers, other Black historians. Would you pick it up?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a lot going on. I mean, it's probably wrong to say that we started much of anything. I think what we ended up doing was writing it down and trying to ask the question of why it wasn't included in the canon of landscape architecture. So I referenced critical geography. The article that coined racialized topography was 10 years before I stumbled on it, and Beth Meyer at Virginia was running the same kind of analysis in some of her studios at the same time. So I think the exercise has been asking that question of, it's complicated because it's not to diminish, like, say, public history or critical geography or sociology or all of these other fields.
Community archives.
Right. They all should stand and last, and, I do have friends who say, well, this isn't really our wheelhouse or our skill set, what we need to know how to do is team up and partner with people like that who can cover it in much more depth. But I felt, and a number of us felt, as we started to translate some of those findings and consider how they apply to what we do, to look at it in two different ways. One is, without that action, would our profession be prompted to reach out, to these others in the first place, right? To ask those particular questions. And then on the second part, was also this nagging, I think landscape architecture is a great profession. If you put me, wound up, key in my back, I could talk for an hour about how great landscape is, right? But Diane Jones-Allen and I, right, used to have these conversations quite a bit, which is, well, what's repelling people from our profession? Is it possible to conceive of the way we describe ourselves and what we think is important as literally repulsive? Bunch of fancy garden designers, only work for rich people. What's fascinating is we've been working with this group called Frameworks to try and figure out how to brand landscape architecture finally, so we're all kind of on the same page, right? And if you've seen like the commercial with the Melissa McCarthy commercial, did you see that in the Super Bowl? It's like, so Mike Gardner, and he goes, yeah, landscape architect. And we're all like, yeah, that's exposure, that's cool, but that's not really what we're about. But the point is, they did these baseline surveys to see what people thought of our profession. And it was, they think we're elite. They think we only serve rich people that have means and control and power. They think that we're not really about people. And so that was actually their message to us. Was, if you want people to know what landscape architecture is.
Shape the narrative.
Exactly. So this idea of how do we have a more inclusive conversation of what we're about, and how do we make it relevant to the actual land-based situations that the next generations are facing. And the Green New Deal stuff and the climate adaptation stuff started to beg that question of, it's not a technical issue, it's a mindset, cultural issue, and there are communities, frontline communities, mostly black and brown, who had no power, no voice, no nothing, and who have lived that experience. And if they were foregrounded, if they were in charge, right, and could tell us, as the rest of us as technical experts, what's needed, how they see it, how much better and further along we would be. So it was sort of those two dynamics at the same time that sort of coalesced, and we need to really challenge this sort of essentially artificial boundary we've placed around what we think is landscape architecture and what we think is not.
Perennial issue is definition of the narrative. Let's have the audience have a chance for questions. Thank you for that answer, by the way. Come on, folks. Chris.
Kofi, thanks for that talk. A comment and a question. One thing that strikes me about the work is the degree to which intentionality is required going in to achieve the outcomes that you're looking for coming out, right? These things don't happen by accident, right? You have a very clear set of goals, and to achieve those, you have to be very clear about the steps and methods that you take to get there. Tony Griffin talks about this all the time. Equity can't be an accident, right? It has to be intentional.
Right.
And I think that comes through. As designers, right, recognizing, you've given us some versions of how you go about designing with and for Black communities, and by extension, Black, brown, multi-ethnic communities that we engage all the time as practitioners. One of the conversations that we have in some of these forums when we're working on projects is the degree to which we talk about difference, recognizing different identities and cultural origins, et cetera, and the degree to which we recognize commonalities. We're all people, right? We were having this conversation in St. Louis, and through it, I kept asking, okay, as we get to thinking about programming and design, right? What is it that we need to do? Are there cultural origins that can be referenced? Are there particular needs we need to address? And while we were having that conversation, Dee Nichols, who's a young Black activist and artist that was collaborating with us, turned to me and said, well, Chris, we're all people. We all need the same thing. We all desire the same thing. And she has a whole piece on what she calls social common denominators: food, water, conviviality, social interaction, right?
Yeah.
We all want and crave the same things. And so I'm interested in having you give your thoughts on these two kind of parallel ways to approach work and thinking as we deal with people from different cultural and racial backgrounds.
Yeah, that's a really, really powerful point. I am familiar with Dee's work, so that's pretty cool. The slides I didn't put in, but I almost did, was in the recognition section about cultural competency and how incompetent we all are in different cultural contexts, and how easy it is for our privilege to kind of drive a situation even if we're not actively doing it. And the challenge to put ourselves in positions where we really do all focus on what's in common. And I learned that lesson twice. So one was, I used to direct our Ghana Study Abroad International Studio Program for a decade. So we go to Ghana, West Africa, we'd go through all 10 regions, we'd spend time in the craft villages learning the traditional forms of making, and then we would settle. The last time we settled in Accra, the time before that was in Cape Coast, working with a local NGO on an action project, right, that we can contribute to. So what was interesting about that process was most of the people on that group weren't Black, African American, had any connections to the African continent. Most of them, full disclosure, culturally incompetent in the United States, let alone in West Africa. So it took a whole semester to talk about the kinds of things that we had to do in order to help people feel like they belong, for us to evaluate whether or not we belong. Because I think in some of this is projection. I think that there's a saying that hurt people hurt people. I think if people haven't experienced or had someone model a genuinely empathetic, inclusive process, they don't know what that's about. So we actually started working at home with, self-assessment and self-reflections, and with small groups of people that they felt comfortable with, and then bigger and bigger, so that it wasn't just that shock factor of dealing with someone who was just spoke a different language, ate a different food, had a different set of religious beliefs, the whole thing like off the rip, modeling it based on where they were, right? And we cribbed a lot of that from cultural anthropology. And we tried to create situations and settings where our Ghanaian counterparts and colleagues were literally peers, right? These people who made incredible things, built incredible things, managed incredible projects, like, look, they are the same as you. They may not have gone to a university and gotten a technical degree, but you all are focused on the same things, and put the students in a position where they were wired to learn. So they weren't allowed to take pictures. All they could work on was in sketchbooks. They had to follow these people on all the time. They had to physically get active, engaged in the making. They had to dance. I can't dance, so I always got killed in Ghana. But they had to fully participate, essentially as an equal. So I think the first part of that is modeling the kinds of interactions you want before you have the encounter with people that are different from you, so that you're forced to really reflect and challenge your own biases and focus before you get there. The other one that was interesting was, which I didn't show, was we were working with the Botanical Garden and the American Indian Center. And I had a whole thing, because I was like, I was programmed not to say American Indian, but all these indigenous groups in North Carolina, were like, no, that's how we call ourselves. And I kind of went, okay, so I had to kind of get over that hump. And they're like, yeah, we want you to do this workshop to do a garden on the UNC campus. And I was like, well, I hate to tell you, I'm not Native American, I'm not indigenous, I don't know what you're talking about. And they were like, oh, no, we get along just fine. It's like, what are you talking about? So this commonality part, particularly like there were a bunch of people from the Lumbee and the Eno and the Hiawatha Saponi. There were a few Cherokee coming from the western part of the state. We probably had like 8 different nations and tribes, about 45 or 50 people. And we found out that we all were storytellers. And that before we got to the technical know-how of how to do things, how we got to know each other was how you saw the world around you. You know, your memories of like really great experiences you've had, you know, in the unbuilt environment in the natural world. And that set like a tone. Like at that point, once people kind of understood that, oh, okay, we do all have that in common, even though we're from different cultural backgrounds, then it got easy to take those next steps. But that would be the other response to deal with the commonality side, which is I found storytelling in the oral tradition and patience, which is hard for designers. We're impatient and we write and draw and it forces a different way of thinking about stuff, a different pace.
It's great. And in some ways, we've had to unlearn how to, well, we've had to come to learn that we're not expert when we're in somebody else's house. And we have to find common ground. Questions?
Thank you so much for your talk. There was such a rich subtext, I feel like, in so many of your slides that was kind of a subversion of wanting to kind of centralize whiteness, especially in your kind of description of the Tar River and kind of recalling the very explicit history of slavery there. I'm very curious, as you're working with those high school students, how have you been able to cultivate a sense of, to displace a sense of victimhood and replace that with a sense of action, a sense of duty, and a sense of engagement. And it really feels like there's a certain level of joy that is based in the work that you do. And I'm very curious how you were, one, able to cultivate that, and also how you maintain that even in your own work as one of the few Black landscape architects, and as all of us who are some of the only Black landscape architects at GSD, very interested in knowing how to maintain that sense of surety. And I mean, as Toni Morrison so well recounts, like trying to displace this sense of like, woe is me, oh, I'm the victim, but finding like a sense of empowerment in that. And I'm very like, I felt so much of that coming through without you explicitly saying it. And I'm very curious how you did that work.
Oh, thank you for that comment. I don't know.
You stumped him, Tyler.
So I'll come at it in a roundabout way. I've had to learn a lot about trauma and healing due to stuff in my family and personal life over the past few years. So before that whole process occurred, in terms of like how healing actually occurs, there are a number of people in my generation that had more of like a Calvinist kind of approach to it, where like suffering is redemptive, you know, so if you weren't suffering, you weren't really doing anything. And, you know, that's actually another generational divide. Like, we think y'all have too much fun as young people. It's like, y'all need to get off of TikTok, get serious, do the work. But when I learned about like how you actually heal from trauma, there's sort of a real grieving process you have to go through. I'll tell you a short anecdote, and then I'll get right to the point. My first time going to Ghana, West Africa, was in 2005. And if you go as a Black American, and one of the places you have to go is Cape Coast Castle, Elmina Castle, door no return, like the whole thing. So, all right, so we go through there. We're walking through. My good friend, Kwesi Blankson, is taking us through. Excellent tour guide. We're down in the dungeon. He's telling us all these stories, like they think over there that that's where Amazing Grace, the song, was created, that they heard enslaved African people singing in the dungeon, which is right above the first Anglican church in West Africa. So you could hear it through the floorboards, people singing, and they kind of changed the words and made it Amazing Grace. And we're hearing all this like wild stuff. But yeah, I'm just in tears. I'm just like, my whole face is just crying in tears. And you go through the door of no return. On the other side, it says door of return. So I kind of turn around, look at it. Oh, that's cool. But when I'm out there, it's in Fanti land. So the traditional group of people there called the Fanti. They're a nomadic fishing group of people that go up and down the coast fishing. So you go through the door of no return, this horrible, like, traumatic experience. And then there are all these Fanti fishermen there, like mending their nets, doing their stuff, and in my kind of American, like, chauvinistic brain, I was like, y'all shouldn't be here. This is a shrine. I'm like, can't you tell I'm crying? So I had like this whole attitude about it. So this Fanti fisherman turns to me and he goes like, look, we were fishing here before there was a castle. We're fishing here now when there's a castle. And we're going to be fishing after this castle is gone. And went right back to mending his nets, right? And that gave me like the perspective that helped me understand that trauma with healing, if you treat it as a permanent state, then you can't heal. You have to believe that there is a place where if you've grieved properly and if you've gotten atonement for what was wrong, that you can move forward. So you kind of have to believe that that's possible. So that's the source of the joy. And I would say that's my message to everybody in design, is that makes us different than a lot of other professions. There are a lot of people who end the sentence with the problem. A lot of professions that end the sentence with the problem, right? We start the sentence with the problem. And our job is to approach it with energy and optimism and a passion to deal with it. And the only thing that it can fuel that's equal to the pain of trauma is joy. So it's sort of finding that with whoever you're with. So with the kids, it was, I'm a smart ass, so I would just tease them all the time. So, even if they weren't really paying attention to what was going on, and I got 2 teenagers, so I got good practice. So I know how to kind of like, hey, you're not supposed to be doing that. Tie your shoe, blow your nose, like, your socks don't match, like that kind of this stupid stuff, right? So it depends on what kind of group you're talking. You can tune it, but I think that, like laughter, right? That changed the whole vibration of the whole room. It's hard when we're talking about like weighty stuff like reparations, but it's sort of even in that space when you see that even in the depths of our worst situation, right? People were dying and, every inhuman thing possible. People were innovating, they were creating, they were holding on, to pass the torch to another generation. So I think that's what helps culture move forward is the belief that you can pass the good to the next. So I would want to send that out to you right now. I'm going to beam that out to you right now. Yeah.
I feel that exchange. We have time for one more question.
First, thank you, Kof, for your talk. I had one question even before tonight. When I was reading your writing about Black Landscape Matters, I was thinking how you put the space during the segregation experience of the Black community and how the pieces of land or the part that the Blacks were allowed were very important to build community, build leadership. And after this lecture, I'm thinking that maybe for now there is also this importance of the economic aspect instead just building the sociability, but also the building the economic aspect of maintaining that community in the same place, or how to engage in the new economic moment of this society.
Yeah.
And if you could talk a little bit as well, thinking about these 2 things, like what are the role of the designers to build these exactly communities, thinking, or this space is thinking about Black communities, or do we have this space, or how should should be, or like what is the moment for us as design to still foment the Black community or leadership and in those spaces of security or safety for in a society that, as you point, has happened, George Floyd death and other issues in that we live.
Yeah, it's a hard question. I think, yeah, it was a matter of emphasis. So if I'm remembering what was in that article, so in Raleigh, there's a park called John Chavis Memorial Park. And when we went digging into the archives, it was right next to Shaw University, Historical Black College University, where SNCC was formed, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So Ella Baker, Stokely Carmichael, that whole crew. So what we didn't know until we started talking with people in the park was that that's where they did their organizing and their training in nonviolent direct action techniques before they formed the organization. So when we were able to kind of connect that dot and say that that park wasn't just for recreation, it was an essential part of infrastructure for political organizing for one of the most powerful organizations, really an ancestor of Black Lives Matter in a lot of ways. Because that was Ella Baker's whole thing, like strong communities don't need strong leaders. That was her quote, really directed at Dr. King. She had a real issue with Dr. King in terms of patriarchal, dynamic male leadership as opposed to a diffuse, you can't even tell who the leader is because everybody's prepared. That came from SNCC. So that was the political arm of it. But what I didn't put in there was if you talk to people in that community, they were also, well, that was the first place I got a job, right? They had like a dance platform there and, I was the DJ there and that's, I was able to do that. Or, they had an Olympic-sized pool and one day, Nat King Cole comes through swimming and, I was the towel person and that kind of thing. So their whole memory of it wasn't just exclusively recreation. And I guess that's the point. And I think the group that comes closest to describing it in a contemporary way is the Knight Foundation has this thing called Reimagine in the Civic Commons, where they have these tools for measuring the performance of public spaces you reinvest in. And they start talking about like civic participation. Does it catalyze or enable local business formation and wealth formation? Does it deal with all these other things that we usually don't deal with when we deal with the physical landscape itself as an enabler? So I would say if that's something that you're interested in, it's not a perfect model, but it starts to codify that stuff. And then, there's folks, Chris has done that. There's a number of folks who've done that kind of work to figure out the economic layer to it. But I think it's essential because I think that in some ways, as long as we relegate landscape architecture purely to leisure or purely to non-human sort of benefits, for people for whom culture is essential, they will not feel a part of it. And part of that cultural enterprise is being able to make a living, is be able to leverage whatever is there to sustain your people. So that's an important thing to hold on to.
Thanks for your question, Muha. And thank you all for being a great audience tonight. Let's thank Kofi Boone.